The most famous date in American history is a clerical accident. July 4th. Fireworks, hot dogs, a nation's birthday. And yet the men who made that nation didn't vote for independence on the 4th. They voted on the 2nd. One of them, a future president, was so certain the 2nd would be the day America celebrated forever that he wrote it down in a letter to his wife. He was wrong by 2 days. And 50 years later, on the very anniversary of the day he got wrong, he would die, within hours of the only other man who could rival his fame. This is the strange, tangled, true story of how a typo became a holiday, and how the dead haunted it. Let's go back to the summer of 1776. Philadelphia is hot, brutally hot. The delegates of the Second Continental Congress are crammed into the Pennsylvania State House, a brick building we now call Independence Hall. The windows are shut against flies and the stink of the streets, so the men inside are sweating through their wool coats. They have been arguing for over a year. Blood has already been spilled at Lexington and Concord. Boston has been under siege. And still, many of these men are not sure they want a full break from Britain. Independence is treason. Treason means the rope. In June, a Virginian named Richard Henry Lee stood up and proposed something radical, a formal resolution, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. The room went tense. This was the point of no return. Congress was not ready to vote yet, so they hit pause. They appointed a small committee to write a justification, a document explaining to the world why 13 colonies would dare to break from the most powerful empire on earth. That committee handed most of the writing to a quiet, red-haired 33-year-old delegate from Virginia. He was a terrible public speaker. He barely talked in debates, but he could write like an angel. His name was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson sat in a rented room and wrote, crossing out lines, sharpening phrases, working in the heat. He produced the words that would outlive him by centuries. But here's the thing. People forget. The Declaration was not the moment of independence. It was the press release. The actual decision came first. On July 1st, Congress debated Lee's resolution. On July 2nd, they voted. 12 colonies said yes. New York abstained for now. And just like that, it was done. The colonies had declared themselves independent. The deed was finished on July the 2nd. One man understood exactly how big this was. John Adams of Massachusetts. Short, round, loud, brilliant, vain, and absolutely tireless. Adams had been the engine pushing independence for months. The day after the vote, on July 3rd, he sat down and wrote home to his wife, Abigail. And in that letter, he predicted the future. He said the 2nd of July would be the most memorable day in the history of America. He imagined it celebrated by future generations with parades, with shows, with games, with bells, with bonfires, and with illuminations, fireworks, from one end of the continent to the other, forevermore. He nailed almost everything. The parades, the bonfires, the fireworks. He just got the date wrong because Congress didn't actually approve the wording of Jefferson's declaration until July 4th. They spent the 3rd and the 4th editing it, cutting roughly a quarter of Jefferson's text, including a passage condemning the slave trade, which the Southern delegations refused to accept. When they finally adopted the final language, the date stamped at the top of the document was July 4th, 1776. That printed date is what got read aloud in the days that followed. That's the date the newspapers carried. That's the date the public saw. And so the 4th, not the 2nd, became the birthday of a nation. Now here's the next myth to break. The big painting in your head, the one with all the founders gathered around dramatically signing the parchment on July 4th, it didn't happen that way. On July 4th, the Declaration was approved, but most of it wasn't signed. The famous signed copy, the beautiful handwritten parchment with John Hancock's enormous signature, wasn't even ready yet. It had to be carefully written out by a clerk. The main signing ceremony happened on August 2nd, 1776, and some delegates signed even later than that. A few men whose names are on that document weren't in the room on July 4th at all. They signed weeks or months afterward. So, the iconic moment of unity, 56 men putting their names down together on Independence Day, is essentially a beautiful fiction. The signing was a slow, scattered, weeks-long process. The legend just smoothed it into a single heroic afternoon. But the fireworks part? That came true almost immediately. The very first anniversary, July 4th, 1777, Philadelphia threw a party. Ships in the harbor fired their cannons, bells rang, and that night, the sky over the city lit up with fireworks. The Sons of Liberty set them off. People put candles in their windows, those illuminations Adams had imagined. From the very first year, Americans celebrated their independence by setting the night on fire. The tradition was born before the war was even won. Soldiers were still dying. The outcome was completely uncertain, and yet the people gathered to light the sky, almost as an act of defiance. We exist, we are here, and we are not afraid. The fireworks themselves were not American. Gunpowder and fireworks came from China centuries earlier, and Europeans had long used them to celebrate royal events and military victories. But Americans took that imperial spectacle and turned it into the people's holiday. The thing kings used to glorify themselves became the thing a republic used to glorify itself. Now, the strangest part of this story is still ahead. And it has nothing to do with 1776. Fast forward 50 years, it is 1826, the half-century anniversary of independence. America is planning the biggest celebration in its history. The country has grown from 13 shaky colonies into a sprawling nation. And two of the great founders are still alive. Old, frail, but alive. Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the words, is 83. He is at Monticello, his mountaintop home in Virginia, deeply in debt, his body failing. John Adams, the man who fought for it, is 90. He is at his farm in Massachusetts. The two men had once been the closest of friends. Then politics tore them apart. They ran against each other for president. They grew bitter. They stopped speaking for years. And then, late in life, they reconciled. They began writing letters back and forth. Two old revolutionaries reflecting on the world they had built. The only two people alive who truly understood what it had taken. As the 50th 4th of July approached, both men were dying. Both knew it. The town of Quincy asked Adams for a toast to read at the celebration. According to accounts of the time, the old man offered just a few words: independence forever. On the morning of July 4th, 1826, the exact 50th anniversary, Thomas Jefferson slipped in and out of consciousness at Monticello. According to those at his bedside, he had asked the night before whether it was yet the 4th. He held on. And in the early afternoon of July 4th, he died. Hundreds of miles to the north, John Adams was also fading. He did not know Jefferson was gone. According to the traditional account, near the end, Adams murmured something about his old friend that Jefferson still lived. He was wrong. Jefferson had already died hours earlier. And then that same afternoon, on the same day, July 4th, 1826, John Adams died too. Two of the men most responsible for American independence. Bitter rivals turned dear friends. The man who wrote the Declaration and the man who fought hardest to pass it. Both dead on the 50th birthday of the country they made, within hours of each other, on the 4th of July. The odds of that are staggering. People at the time could barely believe it. Sermons were preached about it. Many Americans saw it as a sign that the hand of Providence itself had marked the date. A few years later, a third president, James Monroe, would also die on July 4th. 3 of the first 5 presidents gone on the same calendar day. So, the next time you watch the fireworks burst over a summer sky, remember the truth tucked inside the legend. The independence was really won on the 2nd. The signing wasn't one grand moment, but a slow scatter of weeks. John Adams predicted the whole celebration and got the date wrong by 48 hours. And the two men who built it all left this world on the same afternoon, 50 years to the day later, as if history itself had decided to close the circle. If you love the strange truths hiding inside the stories you thought you knew, subscribe to Historian Harry, because the most famous date in America is also the most misunderstood, and there's always more buried under the fireworks.